Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Doyin Atewologun. I am CEO and founder at Delta, and a warm welcome to the third episode of the Delta Talk series. So in this series, we talk about what you, our listeners, can do to create diverse, inclusive, and equitable cultures at work. Because at Delta, we believe that organizations thrive when each person flourishes, and we pride ourselves in being evidence-based and offering practical solutions that work. So our intention throughout the series is to discuss topics that are important to you based on common themes or challenges facing our clients or prevailing trends that impact inclusion strategies at work. We also contribute by providing thought leadership to help you start thinking and acting differently to make change happen for inclusion in a sustainable way. We are always keen to hear from you. We would like to know, what would you like to hear or hear us talk about? What topics or ideas do you struggle with? What do you want some helpful clarification on? And for those listening live, there will be an opportunity to complete a 4-question survey to tell us this. For everyone else, just email us on info@deltaalphapsi.com with anything inclusion related you would like us to help you figure out. Our sessions will be recorded and shared on our social media platform afterwards. Thank you for your attendance. For our live audience, we will stop recording at the end of the conversation and we will open up for questions. However, we welcome questions in chat at any point. If we don't get the chance to answer your questions on here, we will follow up with an email and address any questions we have not had time to pick up today. I am particularly thrilled this morning that we're going to be in conversation with Amanda Gethin, who is the Global Consultant Talent Lead at EY. Amanda and I have known each other for perhaps a decade now.
Probably.
And I'm so thrilled to call her both a professional colleague and a confidant, someone that I see as a co-conspirator as we do this work and travel this journey together. And I'm just going to hand over to Amanda to say her hellos and introductions.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Doyin, for inviting me. I'm equally as delighted to be here. As Doyin says, I am the global talent leader for the consulting business line of EY, and so look after the talent agenda from a strategic perspective for that part of the overall business. I'm also a member of the global Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Steering Committee for the firm, and a member of the Global Social Equity Task Force, which is a group of around, I think, 40 to 50 business leaders from across the globe who came together after the George Floyd murder to think very deeply about the impact of that on our organisation, and more broadly to start really considering the whole topic of social inequity, and therefore striving for social equity, and looking at what we can do internally within our own organisation, but also as a global convening power, if you like, in our communities as well. So delighted to be here to discuss this topic. It's something that's very close to my heart. I can't honestly say I know a huge amount about it, but I am always up for a conversation and expanding thinking on it, because I think it is a conversation that needs to be had.
Indeed. Thank you, Amanda. Today, we're talking about the power and the potential of inclusive coaching. And I am looking forward to this conversation. One of the things that we will pick up on is the question of what inclusive coaching is. But before we go into that, for many of the people on this call, a bunch of whom would see themselves as coaches, I anticipate, or would have experienced coaching themselves. For many of us, we know that coaching is a core, established business practice for maximizing performance in individuals. It's many, many decades old. So if we just kick off with coaching, before we kind of go into the power of inclusive coaching and the context of diversity, I would just love, Amanda, to just hear your thoughts around how you came to coaching.
Yeah, so I think what might be called informal coaching has always been part of most of the roles that I've had across my career in talent and HR. I think historically, then I have learned on the job, if you like. I've done engaged with a few training programs, actually more in the realm of counselling than coaching. But I think latterly I decided to try and develop more of a formal understanding of what it is and what it involves, and to become accredited. So professionalize what I've been doing sort of along the way, if you like. And I'm now about a third of the way through what is an 18-month program. And I'm kind of learning the science of the things, some of the things I might have done intuitively, either rightly or wrongly. So it's been a great journey from that perspective. And I think it was, in fact, in the end, the content of the program that attracted me more than the ability to get a qualification or an accreditation, because I think it genuinely has expanded my appreciation for what coaching, when done well, can achieve for a person.
Yeah.
So yes, so the journey is from a professionalization perspective, if you like, it's only just started.
Indeed, indeed. I'm curious about the content. So there's there's a lot of information out there with regards to being certified around the professionalization of coaching. So what was it in the qualification or content that you particularly were, keen to kind of dig into?
So I think initially I was quite drawn to it because it's fairly academic, and I quite like to study and to think about things, and and to be encouraged to do that. But I think what's been fascinating is the content that's a lot more practical, because it seems to be providing me with a whole range of tools and frameworks that I can actually use. And I think for those, you mentioned that there'll be folk on the call who are experienced coaches. So some of what I'm about to say may well sound very obvious, but a lot of the content focuses the mind on getting better at things that seem easy, or that we take for granted. Listening, for example. I mean, we all think we can listen, and I would have said I was quite a good listener. But I think when you come across NLP related material, when you read Nancy Kline's Time to Think, you start expanding what your own understanding of what it really is to deeply listen. And it's also given a bit more depth and weight, if you like, to some things that I was familiar with before, in fact, even used, but without really understanding their full potential. So, I'm thinking of things like the GROW model. I mean, in many respects, it's been a table, a piece of paper with a table and 4 boxes that you have to fill in. But when you actually delve more deeply into how purposeful that model is, how holistic it can make the conversation. It's all of that I think I've really tried to embrace, so that there's a kind of practical element to it, but there's also a way in which you can think a lot more deeply about all of the different facets of what it is to coach.
Amanda, there's so much in what you said that I love. You talked about getting better at the things we take for granted. And perhaps, for some of our listeners, that phrase will resonate as we think through inclusion, inequities, equities, and the roles that coaches have to play in that. You talked about being purposeful and also thinking about things more holistically. And I think, I mean, there's so much value in, like you said, in kind of piercing or kind of probing more deeply. So something like the GROW model, like you said, so for those who are not so familiar with it, it stands for, could you tell us a little bit more about what GROW stands for? So listeners.
So it's an acronym. So it's goals, reality, objectives, I think, and will. and outcomes and will. And it's a framework to have a coaching conversations, getting the coachee to kind of focus their mind on what it is they want to achieve from actually that conversation, or maybe a program of coaching sessions. And you can use it at its simplest level to set some goals and have a conversation with somebody about how realistic they're going to be, and how up for the fight they are, if you like, to achieve those goals. I mean, you can keep it at a very high level, and I think that's been my experience of it. But there's a reams written about it, including the original book by John Whitmore. But when you actually delve more deeply, it really is about people finding a North Star for themselves, and finding space to think about their position in a much bigger ecosystem than just that one conversation. I mean, my point is, I guess, you can extrapolate from the model a conversation that goes in all sorts of different directions, but importantly a deeper one that explores the whole of the human being, not just the goals that might be the starting point of the discussion.
Absolutely. And so what does coaching mean to you then? How would you define it?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, again, there's reams written, isn't there? But one of the things that I've liked about the program I'm on is that they have really encouraged you to reflect quite deeply on what coaching means to you. What do I want to bring as a coach? How do I want to be? And to kind of define your own approach. And I'm very definitely still a work in progress, but where I think I'm landing is that I see being a coach, firstly, as a huge privilege. I mean, you're in a conversation that is a very precious one. But I see that my role in that conversation is being almost like an active collaborator in somebody's journey. So facilitating their pathways, not mine, their solutions. And so it's great for me, because I've always had the belief, even it doesn't really matter what role I've had in talent, that if you really want to maximize somebody's potential, if you really want to enable them to contribute to their full selves, then embracing the whole human being in front of you is innately important. And also, so is a belief that they have potential. So I'm trying to kind of bring all those threads together in how I approach, my coaching interactions, and just the coaching topic as a whole. I appreciate it. It might feel a little bit cheesy, but it genuinely is, how I see it, that this is all about enabling people to be at their fullest potential, particularly in my context in the world of work, but potentially more broadly.
Thanks, Amanda. Enabling people to bring or live into their full potential. And I want to introduce the context, the idea of inclusion and diversity and difference into the conversation now, because as you and I know, as many listeners know, certainly in the last kind of 3 or 4 years, many organizations have now started paying increasing attention to what their inclusion and equity strategy is, and how they work with different types of people across their organizations. And coaching, which has always been a tool, a technique, a real lever in businesses, is now needing to, in my view, pay attention to the work that's being done in businesses. And so there raises for us the idea of inclusive coaching, and what it is, what it means. And I know I've had conversations with you, had conversations with other colleagues around, what is this? Like, what does it mean? What are we doing? Is this a new strand of coaching? Is it what coaching has always been, but we're applying it in a different way? Is it coaching for diversity? Is it coaching for inclusion? Is it coaching across difference? So I would love us to explore, have that conversation. What do we mean by inclusive coaching? What is it? Is it different? Is it the same? What are key skills required for it? And I just want to, just would love your initial responses to some of these questions.
I'm just going to do something completely weird. I apologize for everybody who's looking, but we're so into, you know, carbon neutrality here that if you don't move for a while in a room, the lights go off. So I'm about to do a massive wave to turn the lights back on. Hopefully, there you go. Voila!
There you go.
Like a miracle. So yes, your question, it's a fantastic question, because I think it's obviously a hugely complex topic, but I think it is one that, because of the reasons you've outlined, it's very definitely worth reflecting on. And it's funny, because when we started talking about doing this podcast, I started searching in Google all sorts of different ways of saying inclusive coaching, and actually there isn't a great deal that comes up that's immediately relevant. I mean, there's a lot. If you put in something like, you know, coaching across cultures, you'll get a whole bunch of things about guiding expats, you know, who land in new countries. So it's obviously something that's out there, but there isn't enough yet that's been formulated to most obviously find. I think for me, it is hard to define, but it's about coaching for equity. It's about coaching for equitable outcomes. And it's about ensuring, if you're as a coach, that you are giving the same quality of experience, if you like, to all of your coachees, regardless of whether they are very similar to you or very different. And so it does involve, and we'll probably go on to talk about this, but it does involve a degree of deep thinking as a coach, and self-challenge, if you like, to orientate your approach to your coachee in a way that you are much more consciously aware, and that you make time and space, particularly, but not always, but not just, but particularly for coachees who are perhaps different from you, to really make sure you are prepared to engage in the right way, to engage in a conversation that will create a meaningful space for them, to be able to bring their full selves to the conversation. At the same time, recognizing that it may be that for some individuals, for different reasons, they're not accustomed to bringing their whole selves to certain situations. So that would be my kind of starting point. I don't know if that resonates, Doyin.
Yeah, so you're starting to pull out some of the things I was excited, particularly about having this conversation with, like what is our ask of coaches if we're going to say inclusive coaching is a thing, is an important perspective for coaches in the world in which we find ourselves. What are some of the skills required? You said self-challenge, deep thinking. And I want us to continue on that, because I think when we think about the fact that we operate in a system, in a society, in where there are inequities, and so maybe we start with that assumption that we operate in a system where there are inequities, and we're working with different people to bring the best, bring their potential, to support their potential, that it may be that we find ourselves in a range of different positions. And I'd maybe invite us to think about perhaps 4 different positions that we find ourselves in, right? So we started this conversation, you've started introducing your perspective on coaching, thinking about how you can work with anyone, regardless of what their background is. And we might say that if you are working, for example, with someone who looks like me, and you're trying to help me think through what I need to do to navigate the EY system, we might look at that as perhaps you as an insider, someone who belongs to a dominant group, white ethnic group, coaching me as an outsider, someone who belongs to, who self-identifies as Black and therefore belongs to a historically marginalized group. So that's one dynamic. I think there's three other dynamics that I would, I just want to surface, and then we can discuss that later on. There's what we've just said. There's the insider coaching the outsider. I think, of course, there's also the outsider coaching the outsider. So many of our clients invite us to work with people who belong to underrepresented groups, because there is a sense of the importance of like a shared kind of affinity and lived experience in support. I have a few questions about that, but we'll come back to that shortly. And then, of course, there is the idea of an outsider coaching an insider, which I think we maybe don't spend too much time thinking about. And finally, an insider coaching an insider, which I would say is typically the status quo. So there's these four different possible kind of dynamics or professional relationship setup. I know I've oversimplified it in many ways because, of course, we're more than one identity. But I'd like to just maybe open up the conversation from your perspective, maybe starting with the insider coaching the outsider, like what your thoughts are about what coaching competencies or what coaching skills, what philosophies coaches need to kind of bear in mind when they're engaging in that context of practice.
I think, it's good that you have simplified, because I think I don't know where we'd even start with the conversation if we sort of immediately embraced all the nuance and the complexities and sensitivities, in fact. So it's quite a brave conversation to be having in many respects, but as I said at the beginning, a very necessary one. I think if you're looking at it from the insider coaching and outsider perspective, I think if the insider coach isn't extremely mindful of the context of the broader context of a conversation between somebody who's on the inside with somebody on the outside, in other words, the imbalance of power that might be the dynamic that might exist there, there's a real risk that coaching will become yet another form of systemic disadvantage, even if the coach themselves is very well intentioned. I think if you don't proactively challenge yourself before you start the conversation to deeply understand what your assumptions are, what your preconceived ideas are, where your gaps of knowledge are, and really understand that those gaps exist and recognize them, I think you can enter a conversation blindsided or blinkered. It's a little bit like psychological safety. You don't concern yourself with psychological safety. You don't think about it if you have it. And this is put about coaches having to spend a moment, taking the time before they interact to really get themselves into a space that fully understands the impact of their lived experience on their perception of the person coming into the room. I don't think it means that coaches whose lived experiences aren't the same as their coachees can't coach successfully, but I think we do need to be clear when we're insiders about and own our lack of knowledge, and engage through a lens of care and of curiosity, and being conscious that you might have to say to your coachee, what do you need me to know so that I can be helpful to you, and embrace what it is that they are willing to share or not. And I think, to your point in your kind of opening about navigating the systems in EY, there is a choice there from a coach's perspective that should be made by the coachee. So if an outsider coachee says to me, look, all I need to know, Amanda, is for you, I just need to know how to become a partner. Please, can you see who I am? Please, can you help me? Then of course I will look to support that, but that innately I would like to feel that I am creating an inclusive environment, so that it's not just centered on better navigating a system that might feel like it's extremely hard work for them and challenging, but more it is more about almost overriding that system and seeing them fully and helping them become the best that they can be, notwithstanding, if you like. So I think for me, if you were to say to me, so what's the to do? I think the to do is to spend that time deeply thinking about what you don't know, what you're, and just challenging yourself. Am I blinkered here? Am I not seeing something? So that you can at least, as I say, enter it with genuine curiosity, to try and create a space where that person feels included, and that the dynamics, the power dynamics, are shifted because you're the one that doesn't know, and you openly admit that you don't know. I don't know if that's made any sense.
Thanks, Amanda. So I think one of the things we're saying, which might be a surprise perhaps to some of our listeners, is we're starting on the assumption that insiders can coach outsiders, and that lived experience or shared lived experience has its value, absolutely. And we can talk about that because we haven't done the insider version yet. But however, if you are, I beg your pardon, we haven't done the outsider version yet. But however, if you do find yourself, as many do, because remember, we all have multiple identities. If you find yourself in a position where you have a set of identities that place you structurally in a relatively more dominant position to the person that is a coach, that you note that and you give your coachee permission to express what that means for them and what kind of support or relationship, professional relationship, they want to have with you. And this makes me think. I was working with a young, an early career young man who had a coach, and just as an aside conversation, he said to me, he said, "You know what? I think a lot of the challenges I'm facing, in terms, the things I'm grappling with, have a lot to do with being a Black man in this context." And then just in conversation, I said, "Yeah, well, have you told your coach that?" His coach was a white woman. He said, "No, I haven't told her." It's like, "Why didn't you tell her?" And then he said, "Well, I think I'm waiting for her to bring it up, because if I bring it up, it might feel like I have a chip on my shoulder, and that's the only lens that I look through." That.
I think that I can relate to that scenario. And as a white person, if we just take the identity differentiator, if you like, being the color of your skin, that's a really good example of something that we never think about. I say we, I mean, I obviously can't speak for the whole white population, but generally speaking, it's not something that you're brought up to be concerned about. And so moving into that, acknowledging that in the first instance, and then acknowledging what, by virtue of the color of your skin, the level of privilege that you have had, notwithstanding how hard you've had to work or anything like that. I think the starting point is owning that, or at least trying to. It's easier said than done, but and then, as you say, trying to create a space where the conversation is such that individual that you just described would feel that it's okay to bring this up. And I was talking to somebody who's actually a Black coach, and often often coaches very senior white men, effectively, so people who are very different from him on many levels. And he was saying that what he does is creates, in the chemistry session, creates almost the culture of the conversation. So he creates almost a bubble of, this is, notwithstanding what goes on out here in this room, in our conversation, this is the culture that we're going to collectively create. And for him, it's often that people want to ask him what it's like being Black, often because they've got Black colleagues that they're mentoring or they're developing, etc. And he likes them to be able to feel it's okay to have that, to raise that. I realize I've just moved into a different dynamic where you have an insider coaching, outsider coaching insiders, but
that's wonderful. You know, so in that example, it sounds like this individual, that the coach is leading the way, so to speak, with regards to, all right, let me draw on what I'm bringing to the coaching relationship, my own lived experience. Let's put it here. And I know we need to be careful about who is centering who is centered in that conversation. So, but the other thing that, you know, as we think about people who belong to underrepresented groups taking on coaching relationships, you know, being coaches. So at Delta, for example, we have a very diverse team of coaches. We have 9 coaches who have collectively coached about, I'd say, over 800 underrepresented professionals over the last couple of years, certainly since BLM. And many of our clients, many of our organizations, as well as many individuals, understandably ask for coaches who have a kind of shared lived experience, who have that common lived experience. And of course, I think that is important. I think this is something, I think there is a slice of a coaching relationship where one can leverage from that commonality, but perhaps there's something for us to think about in terms of the assumptions what might make about what those lived experiences might be. So I want to do a little bit of a teaser to everyone listening. We're going to dig deeper into this. So we're conducting some research with all of our coaches, as well as looking at the literature to understand what coaching techniques are critical as we think about thinking about diversifying leadership and supporting professionals who belong to many underrepresented groups to bring the best of themselves. So in part 2, we will share the findings of our research with some of the research with the coaching professionals, some of the themes that frequently come up, and the most effective coaching approach for that. So we'll come to that in part 2. I'll tell you more about that at the end. And I just want to maybe go back, Amanda, to the example that you gave. You know, you were thinking about this Black male coach who was speaking about the way in which he approaches working with someone who would be deemed an insider, working with more senior white men. So that's an outsider coaching an insider. What are some of the concepts or, you know, kind of techniques that listeners need to bear in mind for that?
That's quite a hard one for me to kind of talk to, except for the fact I suppose from my perspective, if I was the outsider coaching an insider, it's generally that I am a female coaching male leaders in a very male oriented organization, or predominantly male organization. And I think that there are and I don't want to project on other people, because I can only talk from my experience. There are times when I will be in a moment, I feel that power dynamic the other way. I somehow think, oh, am I important enough to be able to coach you? And I think from my perspective, what I try and hold on to is the value that I am there to bring. And that's my kind of central expertise. And that is what I'm gifting to the conversation. And it helps me at least redress some of that balance. I think I do like my friends, let's create a culture for this conversation. And just on your point about the coach shouldn't be the center, is definitely not the center of the conversation. Just to give him some credit, the way he does it is it's like a bio. This is just to introduce myself. This is who I am. And he references I am Black. I moved from Trinidad, and he tells a little bit of his story. So it's out there. So there's a little bit that I try and take from that sort of helps to make me feel more comfortable in that particular context. And then I think that everything else that we've talked about really challenging your assumptions, challenging, and because if I'm experiencing the negative impact of that power dynamic,
Mhm.
then I am only really focusing on one aspect of that person. And so, you know, it's just challenging that you see that. Remember, there's 360 degrees here. There's an ecosystem of which this person is a part, where they may feel very differently to how they present in the context that you normally engage with them. So I think that the starting point of taking that time to challenge and reflect who you are, where are you in this conversation, where are you positioning yourself, where, you know, I think all of that interrogation applies, even if it's a different balance, if you like.
Indeed, and that also applies. You know, one would suggest, one would indicate in an insider dynamic as well, because I think often, you know, again, like if I imagine again, stereotypical cis heterosexual senior white man coaching, the same as cis heterosexual senior white man, you know, there might be the assumption that, well, you know, insiders coaching, insiders don't really need to think about the power dynamic, right? That is the neutral, that is the base, that's the baseline, that is the mode of coaching. And I think that we are saying that in all of these different contexts, regardless of the permutation, that coaching is not a neutral activity,
No.
right? Right. So what's your take? I mean, when an insider is coaching an insider, what do they need to pay attention to then when they're in
Well,
that
I think,
context?
yeah, I mean, arguably, you have to pay as much attention, even if you're maybe having to focus on slightly different things, because if you're an insider coaching an insider, you're assuming a lot of things are very similar between you and the individual, your coachee. And it's very easy to slip into the shorthand and just assume that, well, it'll be fine because I know you, because you are me. And that statement is never true. I know you because you are me. I mean, it's just not. It's just not true at all. And I think that's where again, it goes back to what are my assumptions here? My assumptions are because you are the same. You appear on one level the same as me. You must be. And of course, there will be some shortcuts, but it's just being mindful that not to over rely and over index on them, and to see, again, going back to see this person, who are they, what is their ecosystem, what am I assuming, what am I bringing, what are they bringing, and
Yeah.
paying, as I say, paying attention, because to your point, coaching is not a neutral activity. It's often when you read the books, as I am obviously doing right now, I'm a little bit behind my reading list. It is presented as though it's this neutral activity. I mean, it's very Western in terms of its heritage and its origin, and also in terms of a lot of the things it relies on, like being willing to be asked questions and answer them. I mean, for some cultures, that's deeply offensive, or at least it can be. It's not the less kind of expressive, if you like, cultures. And it's a little bit like work. You know, people talk about organizations as being gender neutral, for example, which they are clearly not. They were originally constructed around men, and a very traditional view of the woman would be of a family, you know, a very traditional view of a family setup. So I just think, again, being the models, everything, it doesn't mean to say that everything that's written about coaching is therefore redundant, not at all. It's how you engage with the materials, it's how you use them that becomes increasingly important. And that's, it's why you have to have this isn't a neutral activity. I can't just assume that if I apply this model, it's all going to be fine, that there is this need to think more deeply.
Yeah. So one key takeaway, Amanda, for our listeners is that, coaches should pay attention to these social and power dynamics, right? They find themselves in. Don't not re So think, be mindful, be intentional about the ways in which the dynamic you find yourself in reflect or sustain or perpetuate or take the opportunity to disrupt the social power systems. And so, I mean, why should they do, what is the danger if they do not? If coaches choose to opt out of paying attention to social and power dynamics in a coaching relationship, what's the danger of not doing it?
I think for me there are two things. One is that we end up perpetuating a system that we potentially perpetuate a system that we know is inequitable to some communities. I think the parallel danger is that you'll never actually truly deliver on what coaching could do. So notwithstanding you might not want to be particularly vocal about social justice, etc. But even if you weren't, that the notion that for me the fundamental tenet of coaching is to enable someone to be the best that they can be in a particular context, and you won't do that unless you are really embracing their multiple identities and the ecosystem and context of them as a human being. What do they bring? And therefore what resources they have, because that's what you're using. You're helping them find within themselves what they can draw out and facilitate their own solutions, their own answers. So I think there's a danger on an micro level that the outcome of the coaching experience will not be what it could be. And then I think there's another risk on a much more macro level, that it just becomes yet something else that perpetuates some of the systemic disparities that we know exist.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am compelled by what you've said. And I'm, very aware of the time. We would certainly be able to go on much longer, but I just want to pull some of these strands together. So first off, I want to acknowledge, of course, like you said, coaching in itself has emerged from a predominantly Western perspective. And I just would love to invite you to share if there's any other worldviews or perspectives or approaches or philosophies that have influenced your coaching approach.
I think I wouldn't necessarily say this. It has influenced my coaching approach, but it kind of influences a lot of how or at least I try and let it infuse into a lot of how I interact with people. Some of your listeners may well be familiar with that. There's I think it's Zulu greeting, where it's Sawubona Shiboka. That's Sawubona is the first piece and Shiboka is the answer. And essentially it's the first person says Sawubona, which means I see you. I see you without judgment. I see the whole of you. And the response is Shiboka, which is I exist for you. I am here to be seen. And then you say it back to each other. And I try and think about that in most human interactions, but particularly in the coaching context, because I think if you think that if we interacted with every human being with that kind of lens, the wonders that we could achieve as a human race would be incredible. So I try and blend that one in, which is definitely not Western in the sense that you mean it, for sure.
It's beautiful. Thanks, Amanda. What for you are some of the key takeaways for our listeners?
I think I would say no matter who you are coaching, factor in that time when you're booking your coaching sessions or whatever to spend time on yourself, to spend time thinking about what you're bringing, where you're coming from, and also reflecting on what you don't know, where the gaps might be. And then I think the second thing is to, when you don't know, ask. I think if you can talk about something, if you can bring something up, you've got a hope of navigating it. If you don't bring it up, then it just stays hidden and misunderstood. And clearly bringing things up, it has to be done extremely sensitively. But Maya Angelou always says, if you speak from the heart, you'll be heard from the heart. I've just massively ruined her quote, but hopefully you'll get the sentiment. And I think that asking, as I said earlier, asking what do I need to know so that I can be of most help to you is I think quite a positive way of finding out things that you don't know.
Yeah, I love that. And I think if that young Black man who was with a coach that I described, if his coach had said, is there anything more about you that you think would help me support you? I think a version of that question would certainly have changed the trajectory of that conversation. My takeaway from our conversation, Amanda, is almost it's a reflection of the conversation that we're having. Like, we've come to each other with an awareness of our professional roles, but also an awareness of our social identities. And we have a relationship such that we could sit down, in the run up to this conversation and say, you know what? Yeah, let's have a conversation about what it feels like to do this work in this body. And let's, figure it out together. And so there's an invitation to everyone on the call to remember that we're not neutral bodies, we're not neutral human beings. Whatever it is, whatever our position is with regards to a disability, sexual orientation, neurodiversity, gender, ethnicity, we all have a position. And some of us have the privilege of not needing to pay attention to how some of those identities or positions influence who we are and how we're seen. And others are less privileged, but to the degree that we can kind of see each other as mutual, co-conspirators, active collaborators, like you said, Amanda, I think there's so much more value to be unearthed from the coaching practice. So I will have to bring this conversation to a close. Remember, this is part one. Part one was a conversation between Amanda and I in terms of our own kind of broad perspectives, particularly Amanda's experiences or thoughts around coaching, bearing in mind her own positionality. And the second part would go deeper into the research findings based on the work that we're doing, what we've surfaced from coaching over 500 minority ethnic individuals and many other individuals who are professionals who are navigating the systems they find themselves in. So thanks again to everyone for tuning in. As I said at the start in the series, we want to talk about what you are interested in and what you can do to create diverse, inclusive, and equitable cultures at work, because we believe that organizations thrive when each person flourishes. So a reminder that we'll be keen to hear from you, what topics or ideas that you struggle with, what you want some helpful clarification on. For those listening live, as once you sign off, there will be an opportunity to complete a 4-question survey to tell us this. And for everyone else, just email us on info@deltaalphapsi.com with anything inclusion related you would like us to help you figure out. A reminder that these sessions are recorded and shared on our social media platform afterwards. Thank you all for your attendance. Thank you for the great questions in the chat. We're going to stop recording very shortly and we'll open up to those questions. If we do not address all of your questions, we will follow up with an email if we don't have time to pick it up. Be sure to follow us on social media for information on the subsequent topics and themes of Delta Talks. The next one is Delta Talks, the Power of Inclusive Coaching Part 2. And I look forward to seeing and hearing from many of you more on that one. So thank you so much. For our live audience, we will now stop recording and open up for questions.